So I am going to speak a bit about what I think people want to hear, which is a very awkward place to be in because you never know what. But my favorite part of these type of encounters is the Q&A, because then for sure I get to answer what people definitely want to hear. So I'm just going to share a bit about my experience covering faith and politics for CNN. I cover breaking news as well as identity politics, which includes faith, but also includes race and gender and orientation and all of the various demographics that make a human being and a society, and how those individuals approach policy and politics from that angle. So these are just some of my findings. Just like you, all of this is still very fresh, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. And in theory, if you had me here next week, perhaps I'd have some new insights even a week later, considering how much is unraveling now. But a bit of my background: my first day at CNN was June 16th, 2015. Which is also the day that Donald Trump announced that he was running for president. So I literally went and picked up my photo ID and went and covered that speech and wrote about it. So I don't really know what a pre-Trump CNN is like. And so that is the spectrum in which I am approaching all of my coverage there and my experience there. But just here's a bit about it, about my time there. My professional background includes being a journalist who studied and wrote about the intersection of faith and politics even before coming to CNN, who also worked very closely with faith-based organizations professionally, and who comes from a family where there are actually more ministers than journalists. But none of that really sufficiently prepared me for the role that faith would play in this election that we just saw wrap up. Perhaps one of the most surprising things about the announcement of Donald Trump running for president was that within about 2 months of his entering the race, the real estate developer who had not previously been spoken of frequently within evangelical circles was actually leading with evangelical voters really early in the race. There was a brief period within about September 2015 where Ben Carson took the lead. Ben Carson, who has long been well known within faith communities and for the role that his personal faith played in his success, took the lead. And that was perhaps not a surprise, considering the high profile he had in the 2013 National Prayer Breakfast, which arguably was the launch of his political career, even if he knew it or not at that time, when he challenged President Barack Obama on the Affordable Care Act to his face. But other than that, very early, Donald Trump took the lead with evangelical voters. And I remember in those very early days having these conversations that eventually showed themselves to be true when the results finally came out. And very early on, I was speaking with professors, and I was speaking with just congregants and pastors who were saying, I don't know anyone voting for Donald Trump in my congregations. How is he in the lead? And I remember saying very clearly, yes, you do. You may not know it, but yes, you do. We are not very public about who we are supporting in primaries. There's a good amount of trying to figure out who other people are supporting as well, and what is culturally acceptable and sociologically acceptable to voice. And we saw that very early in the campaign, and we saw that to be true when the results came out at the, I guess 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks now. Awesome. So I think perhaps what was not given a lot of attention was that a lot of people saw Donald Trump and his popularity with evangelical voters based on the fact that he didn't look like a traditional evangelical candidate. He very openly, unapologetically has admitted that he has not sought forgiveness from God for sins. He has admitted to having marriages fail due to abortion, and adultery, but he's also admitted that he's had some less conventional views on abortion and marriage and other social issues that are really popular with evangelical voters. But I think one thing that the media has gotten wrong in the past that was very clear in this race is that there are more issues than just social issues that people who self-identify as evangelical care about. And Donald Trump was very vocal in tapping into those, such as concerns about the economy and economic development in often forgotten places in the U.S. Also concerns about terrorism and the impact that continued to have in the United States, and other issues related to immigration. And I think when we look at data specifically from the Pew Research Center, these are areas of interest that many evangelical voters express major concerns about, and Donald Trump tapped into those issues very early. But I think what was a surprise isn't that he was able to connect with evangelical voters in areas other than social issues. We had arguably the most diverse Republican field in this election with some of the deepest evangelical roots or credentials. I mean, we had Ted Cruz, whose father is a minister, and we have Rick Santorum, the Pennsylvania senator, who self-identifies as evangelical Catholic. Carson was a Sunday school teacher, and Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, has spoken very frequently and very openly about the role that his faith plays in his daily worldview. And so it was a shock in that sense that when people were given the opportunity to choose a candidate, that they chose this candidate who admittedly was not a part of the community, but somehow spoke to the issues that were very relevant to people in that world. I think what was also very challenging for the media is, as you probably are very aware, the evangelical community does not often have the best most favorable view of the mainstream media for various reasons. And one of those reasons, to be fair, is that there's this thought that the mainstream media very rarely provides a nuanced view of what the evangelical community represents. And there are lots of reasons for that. One of the most obvious is that there's so few evangelicals in the mainstream media. And so it's very difficult for people to write well and nuanced and accurately about a community that they're really not a part of and that they don't know a lot of people in. But I think what made things even more complicated is that whatever you thought you knew about evangelicals before this race just really went up in smoke. And that includes for evangelicals in the community. And I think one of the reasons that was the case is because we saw great diversity within how the evangelical community was responding to candidates this go around. At times it was viewed almost as a bit of a civil war between some leaders as we saw different people approach different issues differently and respond to candidates based on what issues they thought were the most important. One thing Vincent and I were speaking, I was speaking to some students about earlier this evening. I think Professor Theon Hill was leading the discussion. One of the areas of most interest to Trump supporters very early on was the position he was taking regarding refugees and being more careful in the process in which the U.S. government allowed refugees to come to the U.S. And the way that manifested, at least initially, he's since gone about altering this stance, but we saw in December of 2015 him come out with a temporary ban on refugees until, quote, we could figure out what the hell is going on. And the reason why that put so many evangelicals in this rough place, because arguably no community has been more welcoming to refugees in the United States other than Christians, which is not a surprise considering that Jesus Christ himself was a refugee. And so we just saw people taking very different positions very early on issues that we had not seen become forefront issues for the evangelical community prior to this election. Immigration was another issue pretty similar to that. I previously was a reporter in Arizona, and we saw on the front lines many of the citizens really helping immigrants flee war and gang violence and the drug fiasco in Central America. We're conservative Christians in Arizona, and so it was very interesting watching people respond very differently to these issues. I think what was also fascinating for people was this aha moment that the evangelical community consisted of more than just white conservative voters. And we saw people speak diversely. We saw about evangelicals. We saw Black evangelicals and Latino evangelicals approach issues in this election very differently, related to criminal justice reform, related to immigration, related to inner city and crime and police brutality. And these are all issues that historically the mainstream media hasn't written a lot about regarding how the church responds to them. But we saw people very vocally come out saying that it's important to have a leader who understands that these are matters that people of faith care about more than just social issues. There's a broader concept of justice for many people of faith that aren't limited to just abortion and marriage. And so we saw great division in that area as well, and we tried really hard to reflect that. I remember this time last year, I was in New Orleans following Thanksgiving when a host of Black pastors came out very boldly speaking about the rhetoric that they felt like Donald Trump and some other leaders were using and talking about issues related to their communities. And so we just had an opportunity to look at things far more broadly than we ever had before. I think one of the challenges about writing about faith in this election is that the dominant faith story actually was limited for the most part to evangelicals because it was perhaps newsy, but the reality is this is an incredibly religiously diverse country, and there were many communities that felt like their stories did not really get written about as much as they should have been. We primarily only talked about Muslims in the context of refugees and war in the Middle East, which had very little to do with many of the issues that Muslims in America found themselves facing. We thought religious liberty was going to be a much bigger conversation than it actually ended up being, considering how much of a priority issue it is for evangelicals and people affiliated with Christian colleges and nonprofits and organizations that felt very threatened by the loss of religious liberty. And interestingly enough, there was not a lot of conversation about the nones, the atheists, the agnostics, and the people who are less identified with traditional faith movements, which in fact is one of the fastest growing demographics within America's faith community, especially when we're talking about millennials. And so there were a lot of stories that were missing. Perhaps one of the most interesting stories I enjoyed writing regarding the undercovered areas was the fact that Bernie Sanders was the first Democrat to speak at a chapel at Liberty University since the university began inviting presidential candidates to their chapel to speak. And I thought the bigger news wasn't just that he was a Democrat, but that he was an unobservant Jew and was in this space and had significant support, not dominant support, but certainly significant support from the student body and people affiliated with the university there. But that perhaps was overshadowed by the fact that Jerry Falwell Jr., the president of Liberty University, became a very vocal supporter of Donald Trump in a way that I think initially surprised many people who were more familiar with the narrative of the religious right historically, because the assumption was that his father would have never gotten behind someone like Donald Trump based on his personal narrative. But I think one thing that unified many people, not all people, but many people in their support for Donald Trump was the fact that he was not Hillary Clinton. who was someone who was just not viewed very favorably by many evangelical voters, in part because of her positions on issues related to life and marriage. And quite frankly, there were honesty and integrity issues that went beyond that for a host of reasons. And so it was an election where we often interviewed people who were unapologetic in admitting that they were going to the voting booth holding their noses for either candidate they were supporting, which was fascinating and new and ultimately sad at the end of the day, but it is where we were. I think what will be very interesting moving forward is watching to see if the concerns and demands that evangelical voters put forward for Donald Trump, who they overwhelmingly supported by more than 80%, actually come to fruition. I mean, we've seen in some interviews very early that it is not, reversing marriage is not as much of a priority for him as perhaps some people were hoping. He said that law is settled with the Supreme Court and therefore he should leave it alone, which is an interesting argument because one could also say the same about abortion. But the likelihood of him leaving abortion alone seems to be low. He's come out and said that the process has to begin with returning it to the states, and it's going to be lengthy. And so he has certainly not completely backed away at all from the pro-life, the anti-abortion positions, which people voted for him for. But one thing that he has been pretty adamant and consistent about that led evangelical voters to support him was his desire to see a judge replace Justice Scalia that has as high of a view of religious liberty and conservatism as the late justice had. I think what we're also paying a lot of attention to, I think, in the mainstream media, considering everything that has happened, is where does evangelicalism go from this point forward? I think there are different positions that different people and leaders and unofficial leaders in the community have arrived at following this election. Some people feel a sense of peace in the sense that the candidate they backed and who supports the policies that they favor ultimately won. But there are quite a few people who fear that the reputation of the community may be damaged with people who are outside of the faith. And the reason why this tends to matter perhaps more so in evangelicalism than perhaps some other faith movements is because by definition, evangelicalism is an outward focused faith movement where your relationship with people outside of your faith really matters. And so the ability to connect well with people who are not like yourself is of concern to some people. And I think for some people who perhaps felt like evangelical leaders could have been more intentional and aggressive and outspoken in excusing or condemning or speaking out against Donald Trump when he said harmful things and backed harmful policies about Black Americans, Latinos, refugees, Muslims, people with disabilities, and women. There was not a lot of that, and I think there was some backlash, it seems, from people outside of that movement. So it'll be interesting to see where things go forward from here. I think many people recognize how tense and divided the country is right now. We had a survey, a poll that we published earlier this week that says 8 in 10 Americans think that the U.S. Is more divided right now than it has been in recent years. And so whether or not that division there can be some healing made and some progress made following this election remains to be seen. But one of the groups that I think people are expecting to lead the way with that are evangelicals, because it is a community that has spoken repeatedly about the value of unity and healing and coming together to solve many of the social ills that exist in our country. I think another thing we're paying a lot of attention to is just who will the next leaders be, even in the Democratic Party. So one of the main criticisms of Hillary Clinton is that she did very little outreach to evangelical voters, much less than President Barack Obama. And she left votes on the table. I think a lot of evangelical voters felt like, not only from a policy position, but like she seemed to be so uninterested in the community that she turned down multiple opportunities to speak to evangelicals when given the opportunity that perhaps could have helped her gain more support with the community. It's worth noting, though, that very often when given the opportunity to speak with Black and Latino people of faith, she did turn up, and she spoke very often, and she overwhelmingly won the support of these demographics. And so one thing I've noticed a lot in my writing is watching the evangelical left, which is a thing, which people don't think about often because they are not as organized as the religious right in terms of how unified they are. How are they going to move forward and continue to communicate their values in a party that is increasingly religiously diverse and, unfortunately, at its worst, continues to view some people from the evangelical community as deplorable. I think what's also very fascinating, what I'm very interested in seeing outside of the media, is the question, what is an evangelical? So very early in the polling, when we saw support for Donald Trump from voters who self-identified as evangelical, lots of people were saying, well, you shouldn't count them, they're not evangelical. Well, that's a very awkward position to be in. I'm not in a position to tell someone what they are if that's how they self-identify. And I think that was difficult for many people who have a more traditional or conservative view of faith communities, that they have a monopoly on who is or who is not in the fold, which is not something that I feel like I have liberty to do as a journalist. But we saw eventually people who did hold more traditional definitions of what it means to be an evangelical identify as Trump supporters towards the end of the election, even if that were not the case before. But I think something of an issue, a topic that evangelicals have been really processing quite a bit over the last 10 years is, what will the community be known for? Is it a community that will be known for what it is against or what it is for? Will its idea of justice expand beyond issues related to life and marriage? What will the next generation, the millennials, who very much care about faith and in some areas hold more socially conservative views than previous generations, what issues will they prioritize as they go forward? And how will that affect future elections at the presidential level as well as at very local levels? And how will the media respond to that? My hope is that there will be more efforts and resources put into helping cover faith, helping people understand that these values, what people value, the worldviews that shape them, manifest in who they vote for, the policies they promote, and who ends up leading the country ultimately. And so we'll see what will happen. It's been a very exciting time and quite a privilege. And I would love to take all of your questions if I cannot answer them, because quite frankly, they are more personal than I have the liberty to answer. I am a reporter, not an opinion writer. I know in these media times, that's very difficult to see what is which, but I will certainly try my best to honor whatever ideas you bring forward. So I hope this was time well spent for you. Thank you for your time.
Hi, sir. Wanted to thank you very much for coming out. We really appreciate you being here. We appreciate your graceful tone. I'm a big Ben Shapiro fan, and Ben Shapiro has a theory that he's gleaned from WikiLeaks and from inside sources that much of the media has been intentional throughout the primaries in wanting to erect Donald Trump as sort of an easy target that Hillary could have knocked down. He says that they ran more stories on Trump than the other Republican candidates, in a desire to prop him up and make him seem bigger than life, so that during the presidential election, the media could knock him down with all the dirt that they had accumulated on him. Do you think that this is a plausible theory? Do you think there's any validity to this?
I absolutely do not think that's a plausible theory. It's a popular theory. I think what is much more plausible, what is much more true, and what is perhaps equally as negative is that one thing they don't tell you in J school when you're studying journalism is that journalism is a business. And the reality is clicks matter and viewers matter. And in my office in DC, I sit in front of this huge screen that tells me on any given day the 20 most read stories on CNN Politics at that moment. Every single story about Donald Trump breaks in the top 5. Every single story. When I started at CNN, it was the day, as I mentioned, that Trump announced I was assigned, we had different candidates that we were assigned. I was assigned George Pataki, remember him, New York? Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee, and Rand Paul. It's hard to get people to click on a Pataki story. And I tried, I really tried. I worked really hard, and it was really interesting, and there was, I don't want to overuse this word, but I was having close to like this traumatic experience because I was pitching all of these stories that I thought were good stories, and my editors were like, they aren't good stories, and you're like, am I even supposed to be here? You're having this crisis, and then you realize that readers weren't interested in that, and so it was really difficult for me to believe readers when they kept saying, you're covering too much Trump, we're tired of Trump. People were clicking on Trump, and they were sharing Trump, and so they got more Trump. And I think what we need to do, and by no means am I reducing media to solely clicks, but the fact is that does play a role. I have to eat. The reality is consumers can determine what news they get by what they share, what they write about, and what they ask media to cover. And when you click on Trump, that's what you were getting. If there were conversations saying, let's prop Donald Trump up because we think Hillary Clinton can beat him, I was not a part of that, and no one I know was a part of that. I just think that's highly unlikely. I think the facts show that Hillary Clinton had such a hard time even beating Bernie Sanders, that the whole idea that she could have definitely taken Donald Trump out wasn't supported by facts, even though towards the end of the election, that definitely seemed to be the dominant narrative. I'll try to be shorter in my answers in the future.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jessa Potvin. I found your discussion near the end of your lecture about the problems of defining the evangelical community really interesting. Mm-hmm. So if you could convince all the sociologists to do new research for you, to come up with new definitions, or to do more in-depth, division of the different evangelical positions, what would you like to see coming out of that so that way you feel like you could report better about the faith community and their views on politics?
Wow. Goodness, there are a set of core values, right? A set of core beliefs, traditional doctrinal beliefs about Jesus Christ, and what it means to embrace the gospel and take the gospel forward that I always thought were at the core of evangelicalism. But I don't know if that is consensus anymore. I think an interesting label that came about during this election is nominal evangelicalism. And so we'd always heard of like nominal Catholics and nominal Jewish people, but there were we saw voters who did not regularly attend church, except for Christmas and Easter, but whose values they were rooted in that vacation Bible school they went to. And who were from the heartland or still lived in the heartland. And when push came to shove, when they were asked, would self-identify. And so I'm not even sure anymore. And I think that's something that we will see unfold as time went on. One thing I did think was very interesting, though, is that even towards the end of the race, whereas many people in these campaigns try to communicate that they are a part of a community that they are trying to get the support of, Donald Trump never self-identified as an evangelical. He was always gracious to the community and would always say, I want to thank the evangelicals. But he never tried to communicate that he was a part of this community. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the community has a, like, no pun intended, but come to Jesus moment in terms of how it self-identifies what values matter most to it and what it will not accept. So.
Good evening, Mr. Scott. I was so excited that I was released from the hospital today to be able to be here to catch this. I've been waiting for weeks. I live and grew up in this community. I have family members who graduated from this college, and I was like a CNN political reporter talking about faith and politics. So I missed my calling in life. I should have been an investigative journalist, I realized, because I did do some research in your background.
Okay.
And I did listen to a podcast while I was laying in the hospital, and you talked about the social media bubble.
Yeah.
And it was called Pass the Mic.
Yeah.
And I did want to bring that up because you
Sure.
brought up a very good point about social media. And by the way, I am one of those evangelical Christian right. Almost half the people on that presidential stage for the RNC I have worked for.
Okay.
I do outreach. You also talked about you didn't want to be pigeon as a certain
Sure.
type of writer.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't want to be the ethnic whisperer for the
Sure.
RNC, but I kind of ended up in that
Yeah.
role. I did have a question, though, because you said something tonight I found interesting. There was two things. You said one about the evangelical view of mainstream media. And I'm of the opinion and have heard nationally, I'm also a member with the National Black Pro-Life Coalition, which is Dr. Alveda King and so forth. And what we've heard around the nation is the evangelical and Christians don't trust mainstream media because nowadays it seems like media was persecuting the Christian right, as we all know, with different incidents around the nation between the clerk with the marriage license, the bakers in California, the firemen, and so, the stories go on. I never really heard the fact that media didn't know how to write about faith. It was more that some of the faith community felt that the media was portraying them in
Sure.
a picture that was what they wanted to portray. And then another thing you said was the poll about divided America. And people are saying more so. I don't know if you think this, but in my opinion, it seems like this has started since the day of Trayvon Martin.
Yeah,
I mean, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there. And I don't mean this as a jab, but it's not too late to be an investigative reporter. I mean, if Donald Trump can launch a public service career at 70, there's time. There's time. And so I will tell you, when someone says, I've been looking you up on social media, like you start thinking about like sophomore year in college, and you're like, yeah.
Or your mother, as you said
Yeah.
on your Twitter.
Yeah, no, right. No, it's true. No, it's true. So there's a lot of great stuff there. Regarding social media bubbles, there have been quite a few studies that have been done that one of the reasons we view the world differently because we follow different people on social media and click on different links and read different things. And it's very possible that your Facebook feeds and your Twitter look very different. I mean, we talk about this fake news epidemic, which is a real thing, and I think people view things very differently based on who they follow. And so a group I was talking to earlier, one of the students asked, how do we change that? Like, how do we get better access to better news and diverse views? Because one thing I'm very adamant about, if you cannot describe your opponent's view in a way that they recognize, you probably don't understand it. and you can't address it appropriately, and it ends up just being really helpful. And so, like, if the only way you know how to explain someone who is for abortion rights is as a baby killer, you don't understand where they're coming from. And as you can imagine, that's probably not a very helpful place to start. And so I think the first place to start in trying to understand how to get out of your social media bubble is get out of your real people bubbles. It really helps if we did a better job of vetting the people we do life with. And so if the people you talk to and spend time with, and this may include family, only promote conspiracy theories and very uncharitable views of their neighbors, then that's probably what you're going to know, and that's probably how you're going to process the world. If you do life with people who understand that people who view the world differently than you are also image bearers of the same God that created you, then perhaps you will be able to talk to them differently and communicate very differently than they do. As far as media evangelical tensions, I think I've worked in multiple newsrooms, and there's no desire to negatively portray evangelicals as anything other than evangelicals. I think a lot of times there are it's a community that a lot of people don't understand. But there's never any ill intent and any vindictive desire to harm the community. I've said, and I think I said on that podcast, I've experienced more negative feedback as a journalist in evangelical communities than I have as an evangelical in mainstream media communities. When we have people on air, I hear very regularly evangelicals speak more negatively of journalists than journalists of evangelicals. And so there is no, and I mean, if you're, I'm sure people are uncomfortable, but like if you're honest with yourself, you remember Thanksgiving, and you remember what you said about some journalists or some news network or the trolls. I mean, literally yesterday I was on air, and like before 6 a.m., I wake up and I get called racist and homophobic slurs because of something I said on TV. And it's usually from someone with a Bible verse in their Twitter bio. And so that's and if I were not a part of this community and that were my only experience with this community, I wouldn't be running to go do life with these people. And so I think we should be very mindful of the image that we put out to people outside of our space. And to the last piece about the division, you hit a core piece. So the whole idea that America is most divided in this moment, I think is an idea held by people unfamiliar with the racial history of America. We're not more divided now than we were when my father and my mother, who went to segregated schools, were. We weren't divided before my grandparents and my grandparents' grandparents, who were slaves, were. I think we now know, because of the media, that there are people in this world, in this country specifically, who live very different lives than us and see the world very differently than us, and we're having to acknowledge it in ways that we never did before. One of the most interesting stories, criticisms I hear of President Barack Obama a lot of times by people who are more conservative, not always, but usually, is that he's been one of the most divisive presidents in American history on the topic of race. And I'm like, really? Like more than the presidents who actually owned slaves? Like, how is that more divisive? But I think what we're doing now is we're just more aware of our neighbors and how many of our neighbors see the world differently than us. And some of that will be able to be fixed, or at least there will be less division, and some of it won't. I mean, worldview, like doctrine, divides, and that's just the reality. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to echo the thank yous for being here this evening. Thank you very much. Couple of questions. First of all, you had observed that perhaps the evangelical perspective is not very effectively nuanced because there's not a lot of evangelicals in the mainstream media. Yeah. And my first question is, do you think that the media leaders, in light of some of the surprises like Trump's victory and so on, recognize that there's a blind spot and might welcome evangelicals into their business a little bit more, actively seek out that perspective. And then my second question is, what do you think needs to happen for evangelicals to get a legitimate voice of reason out there for those who currently have a very one-sided view of us?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So I actually think I think there are more evangelicals in the mainstream media than people know. It's kind of like, it's almost like a bit of a secret society. It's really interesting. I remember when I started working in New York, one of Anderson Cooper's main producers goes to Redeemer in New York, and Tim Keller, and she was like, I heard you were here. And no, like it's really true. And like she's been helpful, and I was on Anderson Cooper like a week later. So I think there are more evangelicals in the mainstream media than people realize. I think one reason, though, there are not a lot of evangelicals is because of self-selection. And so if you grow up in a household where you hear that the Clinton News Network is the devil, you're not like going to be like, Dad, I think I want to study journalism. And so I don't think it is a industry that is hostile or unwelcoming to people of faith by any means. I think, and nor do I think that you have to be a part of a community to be able to speak intelligently about the community. And so, and I think that makes some people uncomfortable. I know people who are not Christians who can explain the gospel better than people who profess to be Christians. And I think in terms of being more welcoming to recruiting or attracting evangelicals due to how much the mainstream media got wrong, I think there's a moment where many journalists are saying, how can we make sure we are more diverse and more reflective of our country than we actually are? And so it's not just about like evangelicals, it's about how can we have more low-income people from low-income backgrounds, how can there be more racial diversity? How can there be more geographic diversity? I will say I actually think the mainstream media, in some ways, not completely, in some ways, is a little more diverse than people think. Not ethnically at all, but like the whole idea that like everybody who works in New York, DC, Boston, and San Francisco has only lived in those places, it's just not actually true. And so when you hear a lot about like they don't understand about Kansas and they know nothing about Texas, that's not true. Like our grandmas live in Kansas. And so I think we could, I say all that to say there is room for more diversity. And I think there's room for evangelicals to encourage people to have fruitful, exciting careers in the mainstream media, and not necessarily to go with a mission, but to say, hey, you have these skills, you write well, you're a critical thinker, and you're interested in the world, and you want to help people better understand the world. This is an industry that you should perhaps consider. So I think it's a both sides thing, which I hate saying both sides because very few things are equally both sides, but I think both sides could work better at that. So, yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
In your presentation, you mentioned how there is biblical support for a more welcoming and positive view towards like two specific groups of refugees and immigrants from the evangelical community. And then also you went on to discuss how the reason Trump was able to identify or have a lead among evangelical voters more early on in the race was because he appealed to evangelicals besides things like abortion and marriage, but beyond that into the realm of things such as immigration and refugees. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious as to your opinion on why you believe that these issues were determinants for evangelical voters when it seems that biblical support would support a view that would not be in line with Trump's towards those people groups?
Sure. Well, I mean, so the easiest way to answer that is the most accurate way, which is always helpful, is that evangelicals are a more diverse group than people realize, just like women and black people and Americans. But somehow we don't grasp that nuance a lot of times. But I think there are some, like, different evangelicals heard different things differently. And so the reality is, for some people, some of the rhetoric seemed harmful and very helpful. I know people who worked on the ground with refugee resettlement organizations and who've been in the Middle East and who were very aware that if we prevented refugees from coming to the U.S., that people would die, and not just big, strong men who were susceptible to joining ISIS, but babies. Like, they're refugees who are babies. And so some of those people felt very unsupportive of even the temporary Muslim ban, and that made them back away. But there are other people. I was watching a speech last week, and this is an example of an issue that went beyond the traditional issues. So when Donald Trump was giving a speech about ISIS, he was saying that ISIS is killing Christians. And he actually said the main group they're killing is Christians. And the truth is, the main group that they're killing is not Christians. They're actually killing more Muslims than Christians. But the fact is, if he was able to present it in a way that made Christians say, wow, I'm a Christian, I don't want Christians killed for their faith, and he's talking to me about this outside of the context of life and marriage, but through the national security lens. And so when you hear that Christians are being killed, then your faith becomes a national security issue. Now, whether it's accurate or not seemed to be a bit irrelevant, which, with all due respect, was a consistent theme with Donald Trump in terms of accuracy and truth, and Hillary Clinton, obviously. But I think he did a really good job of talking about that. We didn't see Hillary Clinton approaching faith as frequently as Donald Trump did. And I think that communicated to some voters that their vote wasn't one that she desired. And I think if she heard that, she would be shocked, because she's like, that's just not true. But the narrative of Hillary Clinton, and we've got a few great pieces on it on CNNpolitics.com, which you should be following on Twitter, and Facebook, and Instagram, explaining how her narrative isn't to be one that's very vocal about her own faith. So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. My question is more about President-elect Trump's more recent actions, specifically about his usage of Twitter and YouTube to kind of, I guess, circumvent the press and talk directly to the American people. Sure. And I guess a lot of people see that as more convenient, more of an easy way for him to talk to the American people. But I'm reminded of his recent tweet about millions of illegal voters and just kind of stuff like that. And it seems more like, a lot of people share this view, but it seems more like a way of spreading misinformation and kind of not keeping himself accountable to the press. So I was wondering, as CNN or as any big media network, what's the response to that?
Yeah, when the response is that when the president-elect suggests that voter fraud happened at the level of millions, when there's zero evidence of that, we have to cover it. He does. He is more accessible via social media than past presidents. And past president-elects. And it'll be interesting, I think, to see how that continues throughout his presidency. We have been told at least once a month that Donald Trump was going to change, and that there was going to be a little more maybe discernment and self-control in terms of what went out on social media. We haven't seen that yet. We did see, to be fair, I think the 2 weeks before the election, I don't know if, and I'm not trying to be funny, I don't know if they took his Twitter away or if he was just dude, pull it together. And it was great, but I think what we're seeing with that situation, if I can be really honest, is Donald Trump won. He's the president-elect. But Donald Trump wanted to win the popular vote, and he didn't. The majority of people who went to the polls voted against Donald Trump, and a significant percentage of those who went to the polls admitted that they voted for him with their covering their noses. And I think that really hurt him, and it's a blow to an ego. And I think that's been very frustrating for him. And I think he's trying to get the message out to his supporters that actually most people did support me. It just happens that he doesn't have any facts to support that. And so I don't know what'll happen from this point forward. But I have certainly seen him be more presidential in ways that we were not expecting him to. Will he consistently maintain that? I don't know. And I think more importantly, I don't know if he has to. I think a lot of people like that he's not very traditional and that he's unorthodox and that he's a bit of a, I guess he's. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I listened to a fair amount of radio during the election, and both from the left and the right. And it seemed to me that the left was very convinced that Donald Trump was going to have a real hard time getting any women to vote for him. Mm-hmm. And I think the right also were pretty scared that he was also going to have a real big problem. So going into the election night, were you thinking that most women were not going to be able to vote for him? I mean, it turned out a bit of a surprise how many women did vote for him. Do you have any insight into, did you see that coming? It seemed to catch the media off guard, at least on the left.
I think it caught everybody off guard, except for maybe Kellyanne Conway, his campaign manager, who spoke about this very often. And looking back, I mean, hindsight 2020 has just been amazing. Like, I have random moments at like 2 p.m. getting coffee. I'm like, I do remember someone saying that. And it made perfect sense. But this is what we know. I mean, so I think a big mistake that Hillary Clinton made in her outreach to women voters, especially in response to Donald Trump, is she primarily appealed to women voters as if women voters were primarily professionals. And so here's a perfect example. So like during the last debate, when he interrupted her randomly, calling her a nasty woman, they really spoke often like most women know what it's like to be interrupted in the workplace or to be dismissed in the workplace from another man. The reality is most women didn't go to Yale Law and Wellesley. And so they don't have experiences with that. And many professional women, not all, but don't see their primary identity as their career anyway. And so it's speaking primarily from the lens of career and gender, I think didn't latch on the way she thought it would. 70% of white working class women voted for Donald Trump. And that is because many of those voters said that issues related to the economy were more of a priority for them than gender issues. And Donald Trump spoke to issues related to people in many of these forgotten states, many of these places where factories have left, and that resonated with them. And so they went on board with that. There's also some data that shows that many married women vote how their husbands are voting. And so when you see huge, significant percentages of men, Donald Trump overwhelmingly won white men. He won 13% of black men, which no Republican presidential candidate has won at least in 20 years. Many of these spouses got behind him as well. Another thing we didn't see going, and so Hillary Clinton won college-educated women, but the percentage by which she won college-educated white women wasn't like overwhelming compared to Donald Trump. Many college-educated professional women who had issue with Hillary Clinton and even issue with Donald Trump latched on to Ivanka Trump. And they saw something in her that they thought there was a whole lot of, he can't be this because his kids are this. And I think people were able to see things that they thought were noble and encouraging and helpful. And outlook, optimistic in their outlook, combined with just seeing a lot of problems with Hillary Clinton and concerns about integrity and just lots of questions. Lastly, I was reading a piece on my way here based on some political science data in Wisconsin, which was, a blue state which was a blue state, but that we thought would still be blue, but it wasn't. And a big turning point was when Hillary Clinton called half of Donald Trump's supporters, saying they were in a basket of deplorables. And that was very off-putting to many people who found him problematic, but found her dismissive and condescending in a way that was not winsome. And so, yeah, I mean, that was, I'm sure we'll have some more recollections in a couple of weeks, but it was really interesting to see. I think a lot of people in the media thought they knew what would offend women across America, and that just wasn't what happened. So, thanks.
Mr. Scott, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Picotte and the center as well for bringing you. I just had a general question about covering this political season versus prior political seasons, and how the way you covered it changed, and maybe how this political season has changed political coverage going forward, as students maybe are looking into journalism and it's going to be different by the time they graduate than when you graduated from journalism school.
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps the obvious answer, but it's the clearest answer. Like, social media has changed the whole game. I mean, when you're breaking news on Twitter, as the student mentioned, you have to pay attention. When I finished undergrad, Facebook hadn't even come to my school yet. Yet this election, Martin O'Malley announced his interest in the campaign on Snapchat. Like, I didn't even have Snapchat when he announced. I was like, I got to download this thing that the kids are talking about. And so we saw people being able to go straight to voters in ways that they had not before. It really is a 24-hour news cycle. You will wake up and see people covering, people have put out videos and ads and tweets and Facebook posts in ways that, and policy issues. It's not just random like ideas. It's like we used to, one of the reasons, and this is not a defense, but one of the reasons the Hillary Clinton campaign would tell you that they had so few press conferences is because they thought they were just using social media and their surrogates to get ideas out there. And so there was a lot of the traditional avenues in which news was covered just didn't exist anymore. I think also a bigger difference that we saw in this election than we did in previous ones, and I was talking to some students there, and I'm coming back to this, but my little bit of advice to any person interested in a career in journalism, especially if you're still in school, is to study abroad, like even more so than majoring in journalism. Obviously, work in student media and intern as well, but definitely study abroad. This is a global election. And one of the reasons why this was a much more global election is because Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were worldwide known names. I mean, CNN International had shows about the election that didn't even air in the US. Because international audiences were that interested. And so when you're talking about refugees and immigration and trade, these are global issues. And so I think we are much more aware in this election about the world beyond our borders than we were in previous elections. So, yeah.
The second part's optional. But you touched on this a little bit. The very few conversations I had with evangelicals in swing states, one of the big factors was the Supreme Court vacancies, and that's why they chose to vote for Donald Trump, kind of reducing evangelicalism back to the issues, right. Abortion, homosexuality, back to this, as opposed to, and completely ignoring kind of what's going on with the incarceration mentality in our country and a lot of other issues that aren't even talked about. How big a factor was the Supreme Court justices in why evangelicals voted for Trump? And then the second part is, if you've ever met Trump personally, what is your sense, mano a mano, on his heart for all Americans?
Sure. I saw particular percentages of people who would say that the Supreme Court was the factor that led them to vote for Donald Trump. But like most of the evangelicals I've encountered, and this I'm sure has to do with like my social media bubble, are far more nuanced than that. And so you talk, like I love that you mentioned like incarceration. I think criminal justice, it's this issue that we've seen many people on the right and the left, especially in the faith community, be like, this is out of control. Like I was, and care about, I was reading an article yesterday or today, everything's the same day, about as much progress as we've made in decreasing the number of men that we send to prison, the number of women is increasing significantly, and that directly affects foster care and adoption, which is this hallmark issue in many evangelical communities. And so, so there were multiple factors, but very few people, evangelicals I saw, were clinging closely to this Supreme Court case, only because more thoughtful evangelicals, and this is not to dismiss anyone here who did cling to that issue, didn't have any expectation that that was going to be some magical wand. Like, we don't know who's going to get picked. We had a list. We don't know if they're going to get actually confirmed, and we don't know what they're going to vote on. So, like, that was that's building your hopes on a lot of things that were not eternal in that moment. And I think we saw people be far more nuanced than that. I have never met Donald Trump. I've met, I talk to his team all the time. I don't know his heart for humanity or America. I know that he wants to make America great again, and I think my hope is that he does what's in the best interest for the Americans and humans around the world. I will say what is really interesting about him, that like one of my mentors who actually met him and was talking to him about, is that he is, and this perhaps isn't a surprise to anyone, he is a close observer of cable news. Like he knows, like he's met reporters and like he knows their names and is very familiar with their shows and is very consumed by it. It's really funny. I mean, I get all these like trolls who are like, boycott CNN, blah, blah, blah. And Trump watches CNN all the time. We do know that for a fact. And so I think he's very aware of the world around him. How he'll respond to it, time will tell. So, yeah. Good evening.
I don't know, should I lower this? Good evening.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity for tonight. I'm actually very excited to be here because my name's Yvonne Bolton. I actually was the Evangelical Coalition leader for Trump in the state of Illinois. So you could see that this was of great interest for me tonight. I actually have a question for you.
Sure.
You said that, you mentioned that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So I was curious, what do you think of the Electoral College?
It's a complicated history. You cannot talk about the Electoral College in the United States without talking about slavery. You can't talk about the role that it played, the power that was given to states based on the population because of slaves. I think the thing that, and for that reason, I mean, in theory, it is not in theory, in practice, it is outdated, and its history and its purpose was problematic. The thing that I'm wrestling with now is I don't know how, and just briefly, the way I really got interested in faith and politics is that I was in college during the 2000 election, and I went door to door with my fraternity in a public housing community in Raleigh, North Carolina, registering poor black people to vote. And I remember sitting on the couch with a single mom, and she asked me, she was like, why should I vote? Why does my vote matter? And I thought it was like a stupid question because I was like, it clearly does matter. And we learned then that the popular vote did not choose the president. And I remember viewing things differently then, but not like I am trying to process things now. And I guess I just don't know how to explain to someone that their vote matters when more than 2 million people, especially if you can consider the thousands who voted for third-party candidates, can vote for someone and that person not win.
But actually what you're saying makes absolutely no sense to me, because in a sense, what you're saying is if we did away with the Electoral College, then New York, Chicago, and California would decide for the rest of the United States. So basically, forever, the rest of the United States would never get a vote.
So I know that's the criticism. And
It
I
is,
also
but
know,
in a sense, it is not the criticism. It is exactly what would happen.
so let me respond because you
Okay.
asked me a question.
I know, but
So number one, that is the criticism. Number two, we don't know that that's what would happen for sure. Number three, I didn't say get away with the Electoral College. I said I am trying to process how I feel about the role of the Electoral College, given that its roots are in the slave trade, and I am a Black American. So I'm bringing a lot of baggage to the table. That's my bias. If you believe that we should have an Electoral College because big cities will choose the next president, and I hear that argument. The reality right now is that people, the president of the United States is not chosen by the popular vote, period. Period. What I am saying is I don't know where I stand with that. That makes me uncomfortable. And as a result, I don't know how to tell people that their vote matters, given that. That's not me saying get rid of the Electoral College. That's not me saying that Los Angeles and New York City have the right to choose the next president. That's me saying that I am uncomfortable with the fact that someone now would ask me, why does my vote matter? And I don't know what to tell them. I don't know what to tell them. Because the reality is right now, what we know to be a fact, not a theory, is that someone could win millions more than the person who gets elected and still lose the race. So I don't know what to say to that. I will say, since you mentioned it, in 2012, Donald Trump, who you worked for, said the Electoral College was a joke that we needed to get rid of. But now that it works in his favor, it's favorable. So that's a question I think that may be better for him. Thank you.
Okay. My question is about populism.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people have talked about the past election in terms of populism versus establishment categories, and then talked about how populism might be able to explain the rise of a lot of anti-establishment candidates, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, et cetera. So I guess the question that I want to ask is, do you think populism is here to stay? But I think there are a few preliminary questions that need to be asked before you can get to that. So the first, I guess, is, do you think that populism was what was going on in the 2016 election? And second, what do you think the mechanism of that might be if it were actually occurring? And then the final question as to whether or not you actually think populism is here to stay.
So I think populism is here to stay based on the results of this presidency, right? And so Ted Cruz this weekend, I think it was on ABC News, was saying that Republicans actually have to deliver, considering that the people got behind Donald Trump very early, and if they did not, I think he said there'd be pitchforks in the streets or something. And so whether or not the people ultimately get to decide, at least in the primary, permanently, depends on what comes out of this. Also, again, to the previous question, it's kind of hard to make the argument that populism ultimately had the last say when the candidate who was elected didn't get the popular vote. So that's all. I mean, the role of populism in the primaries proved to be effective. Whether the role that it plays after that isn't really true. I mean, isn't really clear yet. I do think what we did see was populism. I do think we saw. I mean, the Republican establishment didn't come around until the last minute, right? Hillary Clinton got more endorsements from Republican lawmakers than any Democratic candidate in the last 40 years. And so it was the people. But whether or not that continues to be the case, I don't know. And I think it was the people because I think Donald Trump was able to connect with people who felt ignored that other candidates had not worked to connect with in the past. And I also think, I think a bigger conversation that a lot of people don't talk about is that people just wanted change. And I really think people wanted change to some degree, almost from anyone necessary, by any means necessary. And the reason I say that is because if you look at different points throughout the election, Donald Trump wasn't only in the lead, Ben Carson was in the lead at times, and Carly Fiorina had a brief moment where she was at least, if she wasn't number one, she was certainly number two. And all of these were obviously non-conventional candidates who had no experience in public service leadership. And so I think what people were really interested in was an outsider voice, and it's hard to make the argument that an establishment figure has that. And so, I don't know, we'll see what happens. But I think a lot of attention will be paid increasingly to the role of the people in electing a candidate.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
So Donald Trump had a lot of interesting things to say as far as undermining mainstream media reporting essentially facts about things he had said or done throughout the campaign. But at one point he even went so far as to claim that he wanted to sort of change libel laws so that he could actually sue reporters who wrote unflattering articles about him.
Yeah.
So I guess, how does that make you feel as a reporter? And two, are you at all afraid of freedom of the press under a Trump administration?
That's a very important question, and the journalism students asked me this earlier. I'm very aware that the mainstream media is not popular with voters. I actually think that's like also this new phenomenon. I think if you talk to historically marginalized communities, the mainstream media has never been popular. I think, though, despite the challenges and the issues we have with the mainstream media, those who are slightly mindful of many countries around the world know that we have privileges in this state, in our state, that other countries would envy. And I don't think we want to move in the direction where there's more government control of the mainstream media. This past Saturday, I wrote at least 4 or 5 stories about Castro. We kept getting news about how people in Cuba were responding to his death. And I just kept reading them thinking, we don't really know if any of this is true. You know, we don't. I know what it's like to cover a press conference that Putin was overseeing. I was telling people I covered a live press conference that Putin has. He has like one big press conference every year where people can ask him anything they want. And then I got the transcript, and many of the questions that were actually asked were no longer in the transcript. And I was like, that's odd. I hope libel laws aren't overturned. Donald Trump has certainly said things that bring his commitment to the First Amendment and, quite frankly, the Constitution as a whole into question. And I think there's some concerns. I think if I don't fear Donald Trump advocating for an overturning of the First Amendment. I think what makes me most fearful is in this day and age of partisan news and fake news that there's so little support for the mainstream media that doesn't outrage as many people as it perhaps should. Because if you don't like CNN and he's saying bad things about CNN, like you don't feel anything. And you don't feel anything until he starts saying bad things about the news outlet that you do like. So we'll see what happens.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you again for being here, Mr. Scott. I know we really appreciate it. You touched really briefly on what might be the future, maybe the unknown future of the DNC leadership, as well as maybe the RNC. Can you elaborate more on that, as well as maybe some issues you've seen covered in the media that might become more mainstream and elaborated into their platforms because of this current election?
Yeah, I mean, so we don't know who the next leader of the DNC will be, right? Will it be someone who continues the message that Hillary Clinton put forward, or someone who will be more aggressive in trying to connect with white working class voters? And I'm fascinated as like a bootleg political scientist and trying to see if the Democratic Party will be able to appeal to people who are both white working class voters in Kentucky and Black Lives Matter activists in Los Angeles, because they haven't tried to. And it seems like they've taken a stand, they've made a decision, and that they've gone for the more urban, diverse community. And so of the names that I've seen surface so far, I think like maybe Keith Ellison, Howard Dean again. I think there's a gentleman who's head of the South Carolina Democratic Party, Martin O'Malley, has expressed interest. I don't know what role they will play in the forward movement of the Democratic Party, but none of them has come out and said anything about trying to be more effective in reaching people of faith yet. But it's early, and so I don't want to suggest that it's not a priority for them. One thing about the Republican Party and its future leadership, and so I'm very much in contact with many of the Black outreach team and the Hispanic outreach team in the Republican Party, and there was a lot of criticism going forward saying that the Republican Party, because of some things Donald Trump said, would not win people of color. As I said, he got 13% of Black men. He got a higher percentage of Latinos than he thought he would. He got more Black voters overall than Mitt Romney did, and Latinos as well. And so I'm less interested in the role that the Republican Party will play in trying to reach more evangelical voters, because they don't really need to. They're kind of owning that. But reaching diverse voters, and whether or not they will still prioritize that, because it seems like you can still win the election without making that a priority. So I don't know, we'll see. I will say one thing that is a personal pet peeve is when people don't recognize just how much our Republican and Democratic parties have changed, just even in like the last 20 years. In terms of its values and its priorities and how it aims to connect with people. Related to that question, just one brief answer. One of the reasons why they say Bill Clinton was very vocal, should I say, in trying to encourage the Clinton campaign to reach out to white working class voters. It's a demographic that he did very well with. And it'll just be interesting to see if they take that advice and move forward with that more in the future. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have two questions. My first one is about the role that the media played in the election. There was, I think it was in July, an article from New York Magazine about, it was called "The Case Against the Media by the Media." I didn't get a chance to read the whole thing, but it was really interesting that even there are a lot of people in the media that were expressing concerns about how mainstream media, like the direction it had taken in the past few years. And so I'm wondering, what do you think about the role the media played? Do you think that it was in any way at fault for how ridiculous and crazy this election season became?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I haven't completely analyzed that. I don't think, though, that I don't buy into the whole idea that like the media made Trump. Mm-hmm. Trump was a major player, a major voice before the media. I think I can only really assess CNN, and only with the knowledge that I have. I think we gave voice to many people from the from Trump surrogates. I mean, we gave equal platform to many people in the community. Mm-hmm. I think whether or not they were taken as seriously as they perhaps should have been, by some hosts remains, is a question that's fair to ask. But I think the bigger question becomes, it goes back to a point I made earlier, when the media is a business, decisions get made from that perspective, and not solely or not primarily, but in part. And I think you have to ask yourself, what is the bottom line? Like, how do we develop a more, a bottom line that isn't reduced to currency? Because we're talking about public service, and this isn't, it's not, what we do isn't primarily in these situations offer a product. We're trying to help people choose a democracy in the direction in which they want to go. So
my second question, well, first of all, thanks for that answer. My second question might come across as a little bit accusatory, so I'm sorry,
Sure.
but you actually brought it up a little bit ago when you mentioned that some people accuse CNN of being the Clinton News Network.
Sure.
And so I know, especially, I think I heard this very early on in the beginning, that CNN is owned by TBS, which is part of Time Warner, and Time Warner donated a pretty big amount of money to the Clinton campaign. And so there were some accusations saying that,
Right.
well, because of that, like even if they weren't telling people working at CNN to portray Clinton in a positive light, that at least there'd be kind of, because they gave money, they'd expect that result. What do you think about that? Like, what did you ever feel any pressure from higher ups to, portray anything in a specific way, and or anything like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, so the meme that's going around talks about how CNN is owned by Time Warner Cable, and there is there are numbers given of the number of employees the amount of money that Time Warner employees gave to Hillary Clinton. The challenge with that meme, despite the fact that at the bottom of it in red, it said these donations were given by individuals, not companies, is that Time Warner owns the Cartoon Network, HBO, Adult Swim, New Line Cinema, and there's nothing in that meme that says CNN as a company or CNN as individuals gave to Hillary Clinton. And so I do know that it is, like people have been disciplined, not just from CNN, but multiple media organizations for giving to campaigns like we're not supposed to. I never felt any pressure from anyone. I do not assume by any means that everyone I worked with voted for Hillary Clinton. But I mean, I don't know anyone who actually told me that they were voting for Hillary Clinton. So I didn't feel that pressure. But I mean, I assume people did vote for it, but I don't know how many people voted for it. My point is, I don't think everyone voted for it. But what I do know is that Time Warner as a company and CNN as a company did not endorse Hillary Clinton. I do know that after he left Fox News, Roger Ailes went to work for Donald Trump. So, yeah.
Hi, I just want to thank you for coming, and I really enjoyed your insights in your lecture. And so I have two questions. My first is, how do you think evangelicals in other nations reacted to this election?
Wow, no, that's a great question, and I think that relates to my question about the amount of international engagement. And so I studied at an international affairs grad school, and my first job was in Cape Town, and I've been involved in missions work in Fiji, and so I've been very much aware of how people of faith abroad process things. And I think the issue that people latched onto most from an international perspective, people of faith, was just how Americans responded to the immigration and refugee issue. I think, so I spent some time this summer in Denmark, and as I said, I was a journalist in South Africa, and these are two countries that also have huge immigration issues in terms of people leaving very challenged communities for their country. And so I think what people know around the world is that there are places that are not safe, and that people in not safe places are looking for safety. I think most people understand that they're not entitled to be anywhere else. But what they're ultimately saying is, look, I need help. There are people trying to kill me. I cannot work and I cannot eat. And I'm asking if you can help. And I think what evangelicals in that space are saying is, hey, my fellow brother and sister in Christ who happens secondarily to be American, what are you going to do about this? That's the interaction that I've gotten. I don't think anyone wants or expects the country to let in terrorists. I think everyone is afraid of terrorists. But I think people are asking themselves, like, what are you going to do when you see that, like, iconic viral photo of that little boy in Syria who was covered in blood waiting in the ambulance? And so I think people are trying to figure things out. I do think, like, to be charitable, I think the Trump campaign is far more concerned about human rights issues abroad than perhaps critics think. But he's unapologetically said he's America first, and he wants to keep Americans safe. And I think that resonated with a lot of voters, and I don't think anyone can condemn that. I don't think anyone wants people abroad to, like, die and get killed and get their heads chopped off by ISIS. But I think people are asking Americans of faith, what are you going to do more intentionally to help in that area? That's been my interaction with people abroad. So.
Okay, thank you. And my second question was, so you talked about the business-oriented aspect of reporting. How do you think that affects your ability to write quality pieces and also report on truly informative and relevant pieces?
I think that there are things I want to write that I don't get to write. Not because no one has ever said, Eugene, that's not going to get clicks. I think we're all dealing with a limited amount of time and resources, and there are very important stories that don't always get told when you want them to get told. I will say, to be fair to my superiors, what I have found is that I rarely get no's. I usually get not right now. It's like second grade all over again. And the reality is sometimes you want to write about things that are happening in a very nuanced, in a very small part of the community. Like, I remember pitching a story, like, so almost every single, like, so we talk about race a lot this election. Every single social ill hurting, like, Black Americans and Latino Americans is hurting Native Americans far worse. And Native Americans have only come up in this election through the Dakota pipeline. And I pitched stories about how can we talk about how Native American communities are affected by police brutality and Obamacare, and but not a lot of people click on stories about Native Americans. And so, so some stories don't get told. And so what I've had to do is figure out what issues do I think people need to be aware of that I cannot communicate through my written work? What are my other outlets? And podcasts and speeches and roundtables are a part of that as well. And so you don't always get to do what you want the way you want, but if you have a voice, if you have an outlet, you can get it out that way as well.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Thanks.
Hello, Mr. Scott.
Hey.
Also, just like everyone else here, just to thank you for coming. It's always great to get a specific face and voice to something that seems like as ironically anonymous and faceless as the mass media. So my question was, you mentioned that Donald Trump gained so many African-American votes, at least in comparison to his Republican predecessors. Mm-hmm. How do you think that happened? Because he said like a lot of questionable things during his campaign. So like, what happened?
No, I mean, that's a fair question. So he really only got 1% more than Mitt Romney. And I think that is because Hillary Clinton comes with a lot of baggage regarding the Black community. The role that she played in her husband's passage of the 1994 crime bill did not create, but played a significant role in the increased incarceration rates of Black men, which is in part, I think, why we saw a higher percentage of black men get on board the Trump train than Hillary Clinton. We saw Black Lives Matter activists just protest almost every candidate that they can because they were concerned about other issues. There was a lot of mistrust with Hillary Clinton that made people look elsewhere. And like evangelicals, Black Americans care about multiple issues than just race. And I think despite the large narrative that there were white working class voters concerned about the economy in rural communities, Black Americans are affected by the economy far worse than white Americans on average. And so his message of revitalization, I think, was attractive to many people. I do think also, we have data that shows that in terms of values, Black Americans are very socially conservative in many ways, in part because their values are often closely linked to faith-based communities. And I think Hillary Clinton was far more progressive on issues of life and orientation than some Black American voters were comfortable with. And I think perhaps some of the more controversial issues or statements that you heard come from the Trump campaign about Black Americans in inner cities, whether true or not, there are some Black Americans who agree. So they voted for the ideas and the views that they agreed with, whether or not they were true or not. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again for coming. So throughout this campaign, we've seen a lot of statements made by both campaigns that spawned a lot of different fact-checking and journalists giving a different number of Pinocchios to individual statements. Journalism is a fact-based business, but some of this fact-checking doesn't seem to be to have its desired effect. People want to believe in subjective truth.
No one cares. Yeah.
I guess, what's your feeling about that? And do you think that has changed over time? And can you envision a way of getting back to a place where objective truth or some provable fact is accepted?
We are in a post-fact check culture. We had a whole fact check team. My friend Michelle is over the Washington Post fact check for Pinocchios, which you mentioned. And I think what we saw is that a lot of times people in the media thought voters cared about things that they perhaps didn't care about. And so whether or not we will end up, I think the way you get to fact-checking having a better, a more influential role is fact-checking what people want fact-checked. And to find out what people want fact-checked, you have to be with the people. And you have to be on the trail, and you have to hear issues that they're most concerned about. But I think very early on, if you look at some of the data, supporters for both Clinton and Donald Trump both said they had integrity issues and honesty issues and trust issues. So I think a lot of voters were just like, okay, both of them are lying, and let's just accept that, that's what they do. And let's figure out, I get the sense from that response that is what a lot of you all heard as well, that a lot of people just thought both of them had honesty issues. And so when you make up in your mind that both people are lying, it's kind of hard to say, hey, I want you to pay attention right now to this issue in which they're lying the most about. I don't know, it'll be really interesting. I think what'll be most interesting in closing is to see if this election really is a pivot in a different direction or if this is just a moment in time, right? I'm sure 20 years from now, this will be like an entire class, like 2016 election in some poli-sci department, if it just is a moment in time. But if it's the new normal, I don't know what role fact-checking will play. But I will say that when you run a campaign on media mistrust and try to tell people that like certain media outlets can't be trusted as well, and they believe you, it makes it very difficult for that media outlet to say anything else about you, even when they're right. So thank you all for your time. Thank you so very much for having me.